Hello. Tonight we are going to talk about ale. Not the careful glass of something expensive you might pour on a special evening. Not the bright bottles lined up behind a modern bar. We are going much further back than that. We are going to talk about the brown, cloudy, everyday drink that ordinary people made in their own kitchens and drank from morning until night for hundreds and hundreds of years, long before any brewery or factory existed. If you are enjoying these stories, feel free to subscribe so you can hear from me again. I would also love to know where you are listening from and what time it is there. For now, settle in. Let your breathing slow. There is no rush. We have the whole evening ahead of us. Here is the part that surprises people. For most of human history, water was not the safe thing it is now. A clean glass of water, straight from a tap, would have seemed like a small miracle to our ancestors. Rivers ran thick with waste. Wells went shallow and stale. Standing water bred sickness. And so people did something clever, probably without fully understanding why it worked. They fermented grain. They made ale. And because ale is boiled during the making, and because the fermentation makes it slightly sour and slightly alcoholic, the bad things in the water do not survive. A weak cup of ale was safer to drink than the river it came from. That is the strange truth at the bottom of this. Children drank it. Pregnant women drank it. Farmhands, monks, old people, servants, everyone. It was not about celebration most of the time. It was about not getting ill. It was the water you could trust. And making it was endless work. Not occasional work, not festive work. Daily, back-breaking, never finished work. Every household above the very poorest brewed. The fire had to be lit before dawn. The grain had to be soaked for days beforehand. The mash had to be stirred for hours, in heat so thick you could barely see across the room. The wort had to be watched through the night in case it spoiled. And then, almost before you had recovered, the whole cycle began again, because the ale only kept for a week or two, and the household would not stop being thirsty. Tonight we're going to sit with that work. We're going to follow a single batch of ale from the dry grain in the barn, all the way to the brown liquid foaming quietly in the cellar cask. We will meet the women who did most of this brewing. We'll learn why the herbs mattered before hops arrived. We'll stand over the boiling copper and we'll wait in the dark for the yeast to wake up. So let your shoulders drop. Let the room grow quiet. We are going to spend the evening in an old kitchen beside a slow fire with the smell of malt in the air. Begin with the river. Almost every town and village in the old world was built beside running water. The river gave fish, and it gave a road for boats, and it gave the power to turn a mill. But the river also took everything the town wanted to be rid of. The dyer's spent liquor, the tanner's stinking wash, the muck from the gutters that ran down every lane after rain, and, in the worst cases, the contents of the privy. People understood this in a rough and practical way. They knew that water drawn from downstream of a settlement could make a person grievously ill. They knew that still water that had sat in a pond or a sluggish ditch, was worse than running water. They had watched livestock die after drinking from a green-scummed pool. They had no microscopes and no word for bacteria, but they had eyes, and they had memory, and memory was a hard teacher. So the well became precious. A good well, sunk deep through clay into clean gravel, was a kind of treasure. Villages were sometimes named for their well. But wells could fail. In a dry summer the water table dropped, and the well went sour, tasting of iron and earth. In a wet winter, flood water washed in from the surface and carried whatever the flood had touched. A well that had been good for 20 years could turn bad in a single week and sicken half a street. And then there was the simple problem of carrying it. Water is heavy, 8 pounds to the gallon, and a household needed many gallons a day. For cooking, for washing, for the animals, and for drinking. Someone, usually a woman or a child, walked to the well or the spring, and walked back again, over and over, with a wooden yoke across the shoulders, and a bucket swinging at each side. By the time the water reached the kitchen, it had been lifted, carried, and set down a dozen times. Into this daily anxiety walked the brewster. She took that uncertain, heavy, suspect water, and she made it safe. Not by magic, though it must have seemed close to magic. She made it safe by heat and by time. The water for the mash was brought to a fierce boil and held there. Whatever had been living in it died in the boil. Then the grain went in, and later the yeast, and the fermenting liquid grew sharp and a little strong, an unfriendly place for anything that wanted to rot. A cup of small ale was, in a real sense, the cleanest drink most people would ever taste. The brown, weak, slightly sour liquid that even the children drank at breakfast was cleaner than the water it began as. That is worth pausing on. The thing we now think of as a treat or a vice was once the daily medicine against a bad well and a dirty river. It was not chosen for pleasure. It was chosen because the alternative could kill you. Before there was any ale, there was grain. And before the grain could become ale, it had to be grown and cut and threshed and stored and kept alive through the winter without rotting or being eaten. This is where the whole long story actually begins, not at the brewer's tub, but out in the fields and up in the dry dark of the barn. Barley was the favorite. Of all the grains, barley repays the brewer best. Its kernels are plump with starch, which is exactly what the brewing needs, because starch turns to sugar, and sugar is what the yeast will eventually eat. Barley also has a clever husk, a papery wrapper around each grain, that later helps the water drain through the mash instead of turning it into a stuck, porridge-like mess. For these reasons, barley became, over the centuries, the grain most often chosen. But people brewed with whatever they had. Oats went into the tun in the colder, wetter lands where oats grew willingly and wheat would not. Rye made a dark, sharp-tasting drink. Wheat itself was too precious for most households, save for bread, but a handful might be added for body. A poor brew might be mostly oats, a grand one, mostly barley. The blend told you, quietly, where you stood. Storing the grain through the year was its own slow anxiety. The harvested sheaves were threshed with flails on the barn floor to knock the grain free of the stalk, then winnowed in the wind to blow away the chaff. What remained was poured into sacks or heaped into wooden bins, and there it sat, month after month, while every small creature in the neighborhood tried to get at it. Mice were constant. You could hear them in the walls of the barn at night, a faint, restless scratching. Cats earned their place beside the grain. Worse than mice were the weevils, tiny drilling insects that could ruin a whole bin from the inside, leaving the grain hollow and dusty. And worst of all was damp. A wet autumn, a leak in the roof, and the grain would heat on its own, a slow, dangerous warmth that spread through the heap until it soured and moldered and was fit only for the pigs. So the grain was turned. A man with a wooden shovel moved it from one side of the bin to the other, again and again, letting the air at it, hunting for the warm spot that meant trouble. The barn had to stay dry, and it had to stay shut against the birds. Every few weeks the stock was checked, handful by handful, for the first signs of gray mold or the tiny bored holes of the weevil. By the time a sack of barley was carried down to the kitchen for brewing, it had already lived through a year of weather, labor, and worry. Dry, hard, pale, and inert. Nothing like a drink. Nothing, yet, alive. To turn this stubborn seed into something that would foam in a cup, the brewer first had to persuade it to grow. And that is the next, strange, careful step. The dry grain arrives in the kitchen, like a handful of small stones. Hard, smooth, dead. Nothing in it yet wants to become a drink. The first task is to wake it up. To do that, the brewster must convince each seed that spring has arrived, and the only way to do that is to give it water. A wooden cask is half filled with cold water from the well or the spring. The barley is poured in slowly. At once most of it sinks, but a few light or hollow grains float, and these are skimmed off and thrown to the chickens, because they will never sprout and will only rot in the steep. What remains is left to sit and sit. Steeping is a lesson in patience. The grain swells as it drinks. You can almost watch it happen over the first hour, the kernels rounding out, the water level dropping slightly as the barley pulls it in. But the steep is not left alone. Twice, sometimes 3 times a day, the water is drawn off completely, the grain left to breathe for a stretch, then fresh cold water run back over it. This changing of the water stops the steep from going stale and stops the grain from drowning, which is a real risk because a seed can actually suffocate under water if you leave it too long. The temperature matters more than you would guess. Too cold and the grain sulks, taking days to wake. Too warm and the water turns foul and the seed begins to die in a different way. In winter, the steep was sometimes set near the fire just to take the bitter chill off. In summer, the water had to be drawn fresh and cool, or the whole batch would sour before it had even begun to grow. The brewster watches and lifts a handful and squeezes a kernel between her thumb and finger. There is a moment, somewhere around the 2nd or 3rd day, when the husk splits and the white meal inside yields to the pressure instead of resisting. When you can press a grain and it gives, soft and damp like a bit of dough, instead of cracking like a pebble, that is the sign the grain has drunk enough. It is ready to grow. The whole house takes on a particular smell during these days. A cool, vegetable, slightly sweet smell, like wet hay, like a garden after rain. Not the smell of ale yet, not even close. Just the smell of living grain waking from its long, dry sleep. When the steep is judged done, the water is drawn off one last time, and the swollen grain is shoveled out, heavy and dripping, into baskets. The barn, or a cool clean-out building, has already been swept and prepared. Because what comes next needs a floor and a careful eye and many quiet days. The grain is about to do something it has not been allowed to do since it was harvested. It is about to sprout. Spread out now, across the swept boards of the malting floor, the wet grain begins the strangest part of the whole long process. It grows, not upward, not toward any light. It grows in secret, inside itself. And the brewster must let it, and watch it, and finally stop it. All on a knife edge of timing. First, the grain is heaped. A low mound, a couple of feet deep, left to find its own warmth. And it does warm. This is the uncanny thing about a heap of wet barley. As the seeds wake, they give off heat, real heat. Enough that you can feel it if you thrust your hand into the middle of the mound. The heap must be turned, again and again, with a wooden shovel, so that no part of it grows too hot and cooks itself. The breath of the grain fills the close air. After a day, sometimes 2, the first pale threads appear. The rootlet, a tiny white hair, breaks through the base of each kernel. Once the rootlets show, the heap is spread thinner, spread out across the floor so the air can reach every grain. And now the careful watching begins in earnest. Each day the grain is turned, shoveled from one side of the floor to the other, raked level, turned again in the afternoon. It must not mat together. It must not lie too thick and heat. It must not dry out completely. The floor is sometimes sprinkled lightly with water if the air is too dry. A man walks the floor with bare feet or soft shoes, feeling for the warm spots, the cool spots, the damp patches, learning the heap the way a shepherd learns a flock. Inside each grain, hidden from every eye, the great change is happening. The starch, locked up tight and useless, is being loosened. Enzymes, awakened by the sprouting, begin to cut the long, stubborn starches into shorter, sweeter, soluble pieces. This is the whole point of malting. This is why it is done. The grain is making itself ready to feed a new plant, and the brewer is hijacking that readiness to feed the yeast instead. Underfoot, the rootlets tangle into a soft white mat. Above, the acrospire, the first shoot of the future plant, grows silently up the length of the grain, inside the husk, never breaking out. The maltster judges progress by cutting a few kernels open and looking for that hidden shoot. When it has grown about 2/3 of the length of the grain, the malt is ready. Let it go longer, and the plant will eat up too much of the precious starch for its own growth. Stop it too soon, and the brew will be weak, and the ale will not ferment well. 5 days, sometimes 6, sometimes 7, depending on the weather and the grain. The whole while a low sweet smell, like new bread, like damp earth, fills the room. The grain is alive and restless, and changing hour by hour. And then, at the right moment, the growth must be stopped dead, because a living sprouting grain is no use to a brewer. What she needs is the changed grain, the changed and then held still, preserved, dried. And to hold it still, she has to kill it, with heat, with the next careful, dangerous step. The grain on the malting floor is alive, and wet, and fragile. It would spoil in days. So the maltster must arrest the growth and lock in the change. And the only way to do that is to drive the water back out of the grain, to dry it, to kiln it. The green malt, as it is called at this stage, is carried in baskets to the kiln. The kiln is a simple and clever thing. A small fire burns in a chamber below, and the hot air and smoke rise through a floor of perforated clay tiles, or woven haircloth, on top of which the grain is spread thin. The malt never touches the flame. Only the warm, drying air reaches it. Keeping the fire right is an art of its own. Too fierce, and the malt scorches, turning dark and bitter, tasting of smoke and char, fit only for a coarse black drink. Too cool, and the grain does not dry, it stays green. It keeps growing in the kiln, and the whole batch is lost. The fire is fed with dry brushwood, with straw, with thin, split wood, never the heavy logs of a hearth. The heat must be steady and gentle, more like a long, warm breath than a blaze. For hours, sometimes more than a day, the malt lies on the kiln floor and slowly gives up its water. It is turned, of course, raked gently so it dries evenly. The grains at the edge move to the middle spread to the edge. The room above the kiln is hot and close, and smells of warm bread and sweet hay, and faintly of wood smoke. Here is where the color of the ale is decided, and its flavor too. A kiln fired with pale dry fuel, kept moderate, gives a light malt, a light brown or amber ale. A kiln fired hotter, or with damp brushwood that smokes, gives a darker malt, and a darker, smokier, more bitter drink. Every region had its character. Towns were known for the taste of their ale, the way they were known for the look of their cloth. Some of that character came straight from the wood on the kiln fire. When the malt is judged dry, the proof is in the bite. A kernel is taken and chewed. If it is hard and crunchy and dry all the way through, no longer soft inside, it is done. If it still gives, still chews like bread, it goes back on the kiln. The finished malt is cool and dry and hard, rattling like tiny bones in the hand. The growth has been stopped. The enzymes are asleep, but not destroyed, waiting for the brewer to wake them again. The grain can now keep for months, stored in sacks through the summer, ready whenever the household needs to brew. With the malt made and dried, the real brewing can finally begin. But first, the hard, dry grain has to be broken open, reduced to meal, so that the water can reach all that hidden sweetness inside. The mill is waiting. The dried malt rattles out of the sack, hard and round and stubborn. Locked inside each kernel is the sweetness the brewer needs, but the water cannot reach it while the grain stays whole. The husk and the meal inside must be cracked open, broken up, exposed, so the malt must be milled. Not ground to flour. This is the first thing to understand. Flour disaster. Flour in hot water turns instantly to a thick gluey paste, a porridge, and the water would never drain back out of it. The brewer does not want powder. She wants the grain cracked, each kernel split open into a few coarse pieces, the starchy inside exposed, but the papery husk left mostly whole. This cracked malt is called the grist, and its careful coarseness is what lets the mash later drain clear. In the earliest times, the grain was pounded in a stone mortar with a heavy wooden pestle, a slow and arm-breaking job. Later, hand querns, two round stones, one atop the other, did the work faster. The top stone turned by a long handle, while grain was fed through the hole in its center. In bigger households and in towns, the malt was carried to the watermill or the windmill and ground between heavy stones for a small fee. The miller was one of the most important men in the village and one of the least trusted, because it was said he always took more than his share. The sound of milling is unmistakable. A dry, rhythmic grinding, the scrape of stone on stone, the hiss of the cracked grain falling into the sack below. The air fills with the smell of dry bread and warm straw. A handful of the finished grist, examined closely, shows the work clearly. Pale flakes of meal, the white starchy interior broken open like a split nut, and threading through it all the papery curl of the husk, kept whole, waiting to do its later job. The brewster judges the grind by feel and by eye. Too coarse and the water will run through too fast, never picking up the sugar, and the ale will be thin and weak. Too fine and the mash will clog and stall, and the brew will be slow and murky. The millstones must be set just so, the gap between them the width of a fingernail, and checked often, because stones wear and the gap changes, and the quality of the ale hangs on. Milling is dusty, tiring, noisy work. By the time a full sack of malt has been cracked, the miller and the floor and everything nearby is powdered pale with the dust of it. The grist is swept up, scooped into baskets or a wooden tub, and carried at once to the brewhouse. Because once the grain is broken open, the inside is exposed to the air, and the freshness begins to slip away. The crushed malt wants to be used the same day. It does not keep the way the whole grain did. So now two things are ready and waiting for each other: a tub of cold, hard, freshly cracked grist, and on the hearth, a great copper vessel full of water, beginning to steam. Before the grain and the water can meet, the water must be made hot, not warm, not tepid, properly hot. And in a household that did everything over an open hearth, heating a great quantity of water was no small matter. The vessel was usually copper, a broad, shallow, gleaming pan set into the brick of the hearth, or a tall, round boiler hung on a chain above the fire, sometimes called the copper for the metal it was made from. Copper was chosen because it gave up its heat fast and took it back fast, and because it did not crack like earthenware when the fire roared beneath it. It was a prized object. In inventories of the dead, the brewing copper was often the single most valuable thing in the kitchen, listed and valued alongside the bed and the cow. Filling it was labor in itself. Bucket after bucket of cold water, drawn from the well and carried across the yard, poured into the cold copper until the great pan was full. 30, 40, 50 gallons for a household brew, each one lifted and carried by hand. Then the fire was built up. Not a polite fire, a brewing fire. The hearth was stuffed with dry wood until the flames licked up the sides of the copper and the whole kitchen became an oven. The heat was fearsome. Anyone standing near the copper felt it on the face like the open door of a bakery. The water, at first cold and still, began to move, a faint trembling on the surface. Then the first threads of steam curling up into the cool rafters. Then in a true rolling boil, the whole surface leaping and breaking, clouds of vapor rising to hang in the beams. Judging the heat was everything. The water for mashing wanted to be hot, but not boiling. Drop the grain into a full rolling boil, and the starch would set hard on the outside of each piece, sealing the sweetness in, ruining the mash. The water wanted to be just off the boil, hot enough to scald, still enough that the grain could be stirred in gently. The old word for this stage was liquor, and the brewster knew her liquor by sight and by sound. The change in the noise of the water told her when it was ready, a fierce roar softening as the boil eased. In that rising steam, something was already happening that mattered more than anyone knew. Whatever lived in the well water, whatever the river had contributed, was dying. The fierce heat was scouring the water clean. Long before anyone understood why a boiled drink was safer, the copper was doing its quiet protecting work, batch after batch, year after year. The kitchen was unbearable now. The brewster worked with her sleeves rolled past the elbow, her face flushed. The cloth she used to lift the lids blackened with heat. Sweat ran. The air was thick with moisture and the sharp smell of hot metal and wood smoke. And the water, finally, was ready to meet the grain. The mash was about to begin. This is the moment the whole week has been building toward. The hot liquor, just off the boil, is ladled from the copper into the great wooden mash tun that stands ready in the middle of the floor. The tun is broad and deep, made of thick oak staves hooped with iron or withy, smooth inside from years of use. Into it goes the first of the water, and then, slowly, the grist. Mashing in is done with great care. The grain is not dumped. It is trickled in, a little at a time, while a second pair of hands stirs the tun with a long flat oar called the mash paddle. The stirring never stops while the grain goes in. Stir, 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 around and around, lifting the grain up through the hot water, breaking every clump, making sure no pocket of dry malt survives, and no pocket of scalding water sits trapped against the wood. This is hard, heavy work. The paddle is thick, and the mash is thick, and the heat comes up off it in waves. The aim is a single even porridge, all grain and all water at one steady temperature, somewhere between warm and scalding, hot enough to wake the sleeping enzymes, but not so hot that it kills them. Get it wrong, too cold, and the enzymes work slowly and the sugar never fully forms. Too hot, and the starch seizes and the sugar stays locked away. The brewster has no thermometer. She judges with her hand and her eye and her long memory of batches gone right and gone wrong. She knows the feel of the mash when it is right, the way it moves under the paddle, the way the steam rises off it. And then, once it is all in and stirred and even, the mash is covered. A wooden lid, or a heavy cloth, goes over the tun, and then nothing. The mash is left utterly alone. This is the strangest hour of the whole brew. Inside the covered tun, invisible, the magic happens. The enzymes, woken by the heat, set to work on the starches of the cracked grain. They cut. They snip. They take the long tasteless chains of starch and break them down into short sweet sugars that dissolve into the hot water. The water, clear and thin when it went in, slowly turns brown and syrupy and sweet. What was grain and water becomes, drop by drop, something else entirely. The smell changes too. From inside the tun, under the lid, rises the unmistakable scent of warm, sweet malt, like fresh bread, like honey on toast, like the kitchen on a baking day. The whole house fills with it. Children wandering past know, by the smell alone, that something good is being made. The mash sits for an hour, sometimes two. It must not be disturbed, and it must not cool. The tun is sometimes wrapped in straw or old cloaks to hold the heat in. And while it sits, while the unseen work goes on, the brewster finally rests a moment, a rare thing, leaning against the warm side of the tun, listening to the faint wet sounds from inside, waiting for the sugar to be made. The mash has rested long enough. The lid is lifted, and a thick, sweet steam rolls up into the rafters. Inside the tun, the grain has settled. It lies in a deep, soft bed at the bottom, and above it, clear and brown and syrupy, sits the first true wort. This is the sugary liquid that will, in a few more hours, become ale. But the liquid must be separated from the grain, and here, at last, the careful milling and the saved husks pay off. The bed of spent grain acts as its own filter. As the wort drains slowly down through it, the papery husks catch the fine flour and the cloudy bits and hold them back, so that what runs out the bottom of the tun is clear, or as clear as ale wort ever gets. A warm amber brown shining when held to the light. The drain is opened, a wooden spigot or a plug pulled from near the bottom of the tun. The first liquid out is dark and a little cloudy, full of the dust of the grain. It is caught in a wooden bowl and poured gently back over the top of the mash to filter through the bed again. This is done 2, 3, 4 times until the wort runs clear. Only then is the stream allowed to flow unchecked into the waiting receiving vessel, a great wooden trough or a row of casks set on the floor. The grain holds on to a lot of the sugar. To get it all, the brewster's spoon feeds the mash with more hot water. A ladle of hot liquor, scooped from the copper, is gently poured over the top of the grain bed, and as it seeps down through, it washes the last sweetness out of the husks and carries it away. This second running is weaker than the first, lighter in color, thinner in body. Often it was kept separate, to be made into small beer, the weak, low drink given to children and servants, while the first strong running went to make the good ale for the table. A third running, weaker still, might be drawn off and brewed yet again into the thinnest of all, hardly more than slightly sweet brown water. Nothing was wasted. Every drop of sugar the grain would give up was coaxed out of it, batch after batch, until the spent grain was finally done. And the spent grain itself, the wet gray-brown meal left in the bottom of the tun, was never thrown away. It went straight to the pigs, who loved it, and who grew fat on the brewster's leavings through the year. In some places it was baked into a coarse bread for the poor. The brewing fed the household in more ways than one. Drawing off the wort is slow, patient work. The liquid must not be rushed through the grain or it runs cloudy and pulls the flour with it. It must move at its own quiet pace, drip and trickle and seep, the tun murmuring softly as it empties. The receiving casks fill, one by one, with warm, sweet brown liquid. And all of it, every drop, now has to be carried to the copper and boiled. Because the wort, for all its sweetness, is not yet safe and not yet ale. It is a rich sugary broth, and every wild thing in the air wants to get into it and eat it. Before the yeast is allowed to do its work, everything else must be killed. The wort is carried, pail by hot pail, from the trough back to the copper. The fire, banked low while the mash sat, is built up again until the great pan roars. And now the wort is brought to a long, fierce, rolling boil. This boil is not a formality. It does several things at once, and each of them matters. First, it sterilizes. Whatever stray yeast, whatever mold spore, whatever souring bacterium has drifted into the wort during the long, slow draining, is killed dead in the heat. The sugary broth is scoured clean, made safe, so that only the yeast a brewster chooses to add will grow in it later. Second, the boil concentrates. Water steams off in clouds, and the wort thickens and darkens, the sugars growing dense and strong. Third, certain harsh, unwanted parts of the grain are destroyed or driven off in the steam, leaving a cleaner, smoother flavor behind. The boil is long, an hour, often more. The whole while the kitchen is unbearable, the air so wet with vapor you could wring it like a cloth. The brewster stirs the copper with a long pole to keep the wort from burning against the hot metal bottom, where it would turn bitter and black. She watches the fire, feeds it, holds the boil steady. Foam rises, a thick brown froth called the break, and must be skimmed away or it boils over and makes a dreadful mess across the hearthstones. Standing over the boiling copper is the hottest heart of the brew day. Faces redden, eyes smart, throats dry. The steam carries the smell of sweet malt and hot metal and wood smoke all tangled together. This was work that aged a person. Old brewsters were known by their red rough hands and their heat-flushed faces and their endless tired patience with the fire. And during this boil the flavoring goes in. Before hops ever reached these islands, the brewster added her grute. Grute was a blend of bitter and aromatic herbs, gathered from the hedgerows and the wild places, dried, and kept in a cloth bag through the year. Bog myrtle, with its sharp resinous bite. Yarrow, bitter and green. Wild rosemary, sweet and pungent. Wormwood, bitter enough to make the mouth pucker. Marsh rosemary, heather, ground ivy. Every region, every household had its own blend, its own secret balance, passed mother to daughter. The herbs did two jobs. They cut the heavy cloying sweetness of the malt with a bitter edge, so the drink was not flat and sickly on the tongue. And many of them helped preserve the ale, holding back the souring for a few more precious days. A brew without any bittering was a dull, sweet thing that turned fast. The grute was the brewster's quiet art. Into the roiling copper, the bag of herbs went, to steep and stew through the long boil, giving up their bitterness and their scent. The kitchen smell shifted, layered now. The sweet malt cut through with something green and wild and sharp. And all the while, the boil rolled on, scouring, concentrating, preparing the wort for the strangest transformation of all. It is worth pausing here, because something we now take for granted was, for most of this story, completely absent from the drink. The hop. That small green cone, that bitter flower of the climbing vine, did not arrive in the brewer's copper until late, and when it did, it was resisted for centuries. To understand the ale of the old world, you have to understand the herbs that came first. Hops were a foreign idea. They came in from the continent slowly over hundreds of years, and they brought with them a new word and a new drink: hopped beer. The old drink, the native drink, was unhopped ale, and the two were spoken of as different things for a long time. People who had grown up on herb-bittered ale often disliked the strange, sharp, resinous taste of hops, and called the new drink foreign and bitter and unworthy. Towns passed laws trying to keep the hop out. Hops were accused of causing sickness, of being a Dutch trick, of spoiling good English ale. What the herbs of the grute did, the hop eventually did better, and more reliably. The hop is a powerful preservative. Hopped beer kept longer than ale ever had, and its bitterness is clean and consistent in a way that wild herbs, varying year to year and place to place, could never quite match. Slowly, over generations, the hop won. By the end of the period we are talking about, most of what people drank was hopped, and the old grute herbs had faded to a memory, gathered only by the oldest country folk and the poorest, who could not afford to buy hops. But for hundreds and hundreds of years, the flavor of the daily drink came from the hedge and the bog, not from a tended field. The gathering of the grute herbs was its own small round of the year. In late summer, women walked out to the wet places and the waste ground, baskets over their arms, and cut the bitter plants at their peak. Bog myrtle from the marshes, its gray-green leaves sharp with resin. Yarrow from the dry grassy banks, its feathery leaves, and flat pale flower heads. Sweet gale, ground ivy, heather flowers, wild rosemary from the acid soils. Wormwood, the bitterest of all, used sparingly. The cut herbs were tied in small bunches and hung in the rafters to dry, away from the damp, and there they hung all winter, slowly releasing their scent into the smoky air of the house. When a brew was planned, a handful was taken down, crumbled, and sewn into the little cloth bag that would steep in the boiling wort. The exact mix was a household secret, a thing of pride, a recipe never written down. One house's ale tasted different from the next, and the difference lived in those dried herbs. So the old ale was layered, and strange to a modern tongue, sweet malt underneath, and on top a wild green bitter tangle of meadow and marsh, varying with the season and the place, never twice quite the same. It was a drink of its landscape, flavored by the very ground the barley grew from. We have lost that drink almost entirely. Only the names of a few of the herbs survive, and the memory of a bitterness that came from somewhere wilder than a hop garden. The boil is done. The herbs have given up their bitterness. The wort is dark and strong and scoured clean. And now comes one of the most anxious passages of the whole brew, because the hot liquid must be cooled, and cooled as quickly as may be, before anything unwanted finds its way into it. There were no cooling coils, no cold water jackets, nothing of the sort. The hot wort was ladled out of the copper, steaming and scalding into wide, shallow wooden trays called coolships, set out on the floor, or even out in the yard on a stand, to catch the air. Sometimes it was simply left in the copper with the fire drawn, the great pan left to radiate its heat slowly into the evening. The wider and shallower the vessel, the faster the wort gave up its heat. And here was the danger. While the wort was hot, it was safe, because nothing could live in it. But the moment it dropped below scalding, the moment it became merely warm, every living thing in the air wanted in. Fruit, flies, dust, the invisible wild yeasts that clung to every beam and every skin. Leave the cooling wort exposed too long, and it would be invaded before the brewster ever added her own yeast, and the ale would sour or turn to vinegar, or come out tasting of nothing a person would willingly drink. So the cooling was watched. The brewster, or one of her children, stood over the shallow trays as the steam thinned, and the surface went still, skimming off any leaf or fly or speck that drifted in, waiting, hand-hovering. For the exact moment the wort was cool enough, and no cooler than necessary, because every extra hour of cooling was an extra hour of risk. In winter, the cooling was fast, and the risk small. A cold night would take the heat out of the wort in an hour or two, and the cold itself helped protect the batch. In summer the cooling dragged, the warm wort sitting dangerous and inviting for half the day, and summer brews were feared and often lost. Many a household simply stopped brewing in the hottest weeks, because the ale would not keep, and the wort would not cool clean. There is a strange beauty in a coolship of wort at dusk. The shallow tray, the dark mirror of liquid going still, the last thin curl of steam catching the last of the light. The house goes quiet around it. The fire is allowed to die. The whole long day of heat and labor and noise settles at last into stillness. And the wort, cooled, ready, waits. It has traveled a long way, from dry hard grain in the barn, through steeping and sprouting, and kilning and milling and mashing and boiling. It has become a dark, sweet, sterile liquid, all its sweetness unlocked and ready. It lacks only one thing. It lacks only one thing. The living thing that will turn sugar into drink. The thing that, until very recently in human history, no one fully understood. The yeast. Of all the forces at work in the old brewhouse. The yeast was the most powerful and the least understood. The people who made ale every week of their lives never saw it, not once. They did not know it was a lot. They did not know it was there, and yet they tended it, and fed it, and feared losing it, and could not have made a single cup of ale without it. We know now what they did not. Yeast is a tiny living fungus, a single-celled creature that eats sugar and in eating it, turns it into alcohol and a gas. Drop yeast into sweet wort, and the yeast multiplies wildly. Billions upon billions of invisible cells, devouring the sugar, releasing the alcohol that makes the drink strong, and the gas that makes it foam. The change from sweet brown broth to ale. Without yeast, the wort would sit forever, sweet and still and lifeless, and never become anything at all. But, to the brewster, yeast was simply a thing, a substance, with a name that meant the foam itself. She called it barm, or goddess good, or simply the working, and she kept it. Every time a batch fermented, a thick foamy head of barm rose to the top of the vessel. That barm, skimmed off and saved in a wooden bowl, was the seed of the next brew. Skim, save, use again. A household's yeast was a living heirloom, passed down through the years, sometimes through the generations, never allowed to die. Losing the yeast was a small disaster. If the barm spoiled or dried out, or was accidentally thrown away, the household had no way to start the next brew. They would have to borrow from a neighbor, or buy a little from another brewster, or wait and hope that the wild yeasts of the air would, this once, do the work cleanly instead of souring the batch. Some of the wildest, strangest batches came from such accidents, when the wrong yeast took hold, and the ale came out sharp or cloudy or oddly fruity. The old name for the moment the yeast began to work is telling, goddess good. They could not explain why the wort suddenly foamed and warmed and changed. They only knew that sometimes it did, and when it did, something good had happened, a gift, a blessing on the careful day's work. The bubbling, the rising heat, the transformation, all happened on its own, as if by grace, so they named it for the goodness they could not account for. Even the shape of the foam told stories. A thick, clean white head, rising fast, meant a healthy working batch. A thin, patchy foam, slow to rise, meant trouble. A foam that collapsed and turned the wort sharp meant the batch was lost to souring. The brewster read the surface of the fermenting vessel the way a sailor reads the sea, learning the weather of the yeast, knowing when it was well and when it was going wrong. So the cooling wort, lying still and clean in its coolship, was about to receive the most precious and most mysterious ingredient of all. A spoonful of living foam, saved from the last batch, carried across the kitchen in a wooden bowl. Carried carefully, because on that spoonful, that invisible trembling inheritance, the whole next week's drinking would depend. Cooled wort is drawn off into the working vessel, sometimes a great wooden cask standing on its end, open at the top. Sometimes a deep stone trough or a broad earthen pan. Whatever the household had. Into this dark, sweet liquid, the saved barm is tipped, the yeast meets the wort. And then, for a while, nothing seems to happen at all. This waiting is its own kind of torment. The brewster has done everything right, followed every step, watched every temperature, and now she must simply wait and trust. The yeast, dropped into a vast new ocean of sugar, needs time to wake and spread and multiply. For hours, sometimes, the surface of the wort stays flat and still. A careful eye is kept on it. Is it working yet? Has it begun? Will it begin at all? Then the first sign, a faint mist on the surface, like breath on a cold morning. A few tiny bubbles, rising and breaking. A warmth building in the wood of the vessel as the yeast, invisible, ferments the sugar, and gives off heat. And then, suddenly, it takes. The whole surface begins to move. A fine white cream spreads across the wort. The bubbles come faster, thicker, a low constant murmur from inside the cask. The foam rises. A working vat in full ferment is a remarkable thing. The surface heaves. The foam climbs, inch by inch, a living crown that must be watched, lest it overflow the cask and spill across the floor. A stick is kept handy to break the foam if it rises too high, knocking the crust down so the working stays inside the vessel. The whole cask shudders faintly with the gas coming off. The smell fills the house, warm and beery and alive, the true smell of ale being made. The gas itself was mostly wasted, lost to the air, though the sharp-eyed might notice it pooling unseen in the low places of the room, heavier than the air around it, sometimes enough to put out a low candle. No one knew what it was. No one thought to catch it or bottle it. It was simply part of the working, a sign that the yeast was healthy and the batch was going well. Fermentation runs hot and then slows. The furious first day, when the foam rises fastest, is called the high krausen. By the second day, the foam begins to fall back, the bubbles thinning, the murmur quieting. By the third day, the surface is mostly still again, only a few lazy bubbles rising through the dark liquid. The sugar is mostly eaten, the alcohol is made, the ale is nearly ale. Through all of this, the vessel must be watched. A ferment that runs too hot can give a rough, harsh, sour-tasting drink. A ferment that stops too early leaves the ale sweet and weak and likely to spoil. The brewster tastes and smells and listens and judges. And when the working is done, when the foam has fallen and the murmur has gone quiet, the young ale must be drawn off its bed of tired yeast and put somewhere to settle and clear. The cellar is waiting. The young ale is drawn off the tired yeast and carried down into the cellar. And here, in the cool dark, it must learn to be still. The cellar was the quiet heart of the whole household, though no one ever spoke of it that way. Dug into the ground beneath the kitchen, or cut into a bank behind the house. Its walls were of earth or stone, and its air was cool and damp, and still the whole year through. In summer, it was the only place in the house that stayed pleasantly cold. In winter, it never froze. This even coolness was exactly what the ale needed now. The cloudy dark liquid, full of tired yeast, and bits of grain, and the dust of the herbs, was run into casks, or into a great earthen settling pan, and left utterly alone. Day after day. In the cool, still air of the cellar, the slow magic of clearing happened. The heavy particles, the bits of grain and the spent yeast, sank by their own weight to the bottom, forming a soft gray sediment called the lees. The clear amber ale rose above it, slowly brightening, like a pond settling after a storm. This took days. There was no hurrying it. Move the cask, knock it, shake the cellar floor, and the clearing was undone, the sediment swirling back up into the liquid, and the wait had to begin again. The ale was handled as little as possible, drawn off gently from above the lees when it was wanted, never disturbing the soft gray layer at the bottom. The cellar held more than ale. Cheese rested there, maturing slowly on its shelves. Salted meat hung from the beams, barrels of pickled things, crocks of last year's preserves. It was the larder and the cold store and the drinks cabinet all in one. A single cool dark room that kept the whole household fed and watered through the lean months. The smell of a good cellar was a layered thing, earth and stone and malt and age. The temperature of the cellar decided how the ale finished. Too warm, and the last of the fermentation ran on too fast, leaving a harsh drink. Too cold, and the yeast went dormant before its work was quite done, leaving the ale cloudy and sweet. A good cellar, deep and even, produced a clean bright ale that settled clear in a few days and drank smooth. A poor cellar, shallow and variable, gave trouble all year round. And the lees, the gray sediment at the bottom of every cask, were useful in their own right. They were rich in yeast, and were sometimes saved to start the next brew. They were spread on the garden as fertilizer, the yeast feeding the soil. In hard times they were even baked, mixed with whatever meal could be spared, into a coarse, bitter bread that kept the very poorest alive. Nothing in the brew was wasted, right down to the dregs. When the ale had cleared, when a candle held behind a sample glass showed a bright clear liquid with only a thin pale line of sediment below, it was ready to be tapped. Ready at last to be drunk. The long week of work was almost over. The vessel the ale lived in mattered more than you might think. A cask was not just a container. It was a living thing, made of wood. And the wood breathed, and what it breathed changed the drink inside. Most ale casks were oak, the same wood that gave the great beams of the house and the staves of the well bucket. Oak was strong and tight-grained, and it held its shape, and it gave up a slow, quiet flavor of its own to the ale that rested in it. A new cask made the ale taste of the wood, sharp and raw, until the cask had been used a few times and had settled into itself. An old cask, well kept, gave almost no flavor of its own, and let the ale taste of malt and herb alone. Keeping the casks was a constant chore. The moment a cask was emptied, it had to be washed, scalded, and dried, or it would sour and taint the next batch put into it. A soured cask was a serious loss. The inside would have to be scraped and scoured and sometimes burned out with a sulfur wick, a stinking, dangerous job, before the wood could be trusted again. A brewster's reputation lived and died on the cleanliness of her casks. When the cleared ale was filled into a cask for drinking, the cask was set on a wooden stand, on its side, with the bunghole turned up. A small wooden plug, the spile, was driven loosely into the bung to let the last faint gases of fermentation escape, without letting air rush in. The ale was left to rest a day or two more, conditioning, settling its last sediment against the lower curve of the cask. Then the tap was driven in. The tap was a wooden spigot, sometimes a hollowed elder stem, hammered sharply into the bunghole at the low end of the cask. Driving the tap was a small skill. Too soft a blow, and the tap leaked. Too hard, and the cask split. Once driven, the tap was left in place, and a wooden spile, or a wisp of straw, plugged it between drawings to keep the air out and the ale in. Drawing a cup of ale was a small ritual. The plug was pulled. A cup, a wooden bowl, a leather jack, or a horn beaker was held under the tap. The tap was turned, or the spile drawn, and the clear brown ale ran out in a thin, steady stream, foaming faintly as it met the air. The first cup of a new cask was always tasted by the brewster herself, judging the work of the whole week in a single swallow. Was it clear? Was it clean? Was it sour or harsh or weak? Did it do her credit? A good ale, freshly tapped, was a deep amber brown, slightly cloudy if the cup was drawn carelessly, bright if the cellar had done its work. It foamed mildly in the cup. It smelled of warm malt and the faint green ghost of the Brewed herbs. It tasted sweet and bitter at once, the malt underneath, the herbs cutting through, a slight sourness from the fermentation. It was not cold. Cellar temperature, cool but not cold. It was not fizzy, not really, only the faintest prickle of the last gas. It was a drink to be swallowed slowly, by the cupful, through the long evening, beside the fire. The household at last had its drink. The well and the river and the dirty ditch were forgotten. For a week or two, the cask on its stand would hold the safest, cleanest liquid any of them would touch. Not every cup drawn from the cellar was the same drink. The household drank in a hierarchy, and the ale reflected it, because a single mash made more than one strength of liquid. The first running, the strongest, the richest, the darkest, was the ale proper. It went to the head of the house, to the grown men after their work, to guests of standing, to the table on a feast day. It was the drink that did you credit, the drink a man expected after a day in the fields, strong enough to feel in the legs after a cup or two, kept, if the cellar was good, for a week or two before it turned. Below it came the small beer, made from the second running of the mash, the weaker wort washed through the spent grain. It was thin and pale and low in strength. This was the everyday drink of the whole household, poured out by the jugful and consumed from morning to night. The servants drank it. The laborers took a jug of it to the fields. The children drank it from their first cups. A child in the old world did not drink water with meals. A child drank small beer. This is the part that is hardest for us to grasp. Across the centuries, the daily drink of the young was a weak alcoholic brew. Not because anyone wished to make children drunk. The small beer was so low in strength that a child would have to drink an impossible amount to feel it. It was simply that the small beer was safe, and the water was not. And so the small beer is what you gave your children, and what your mother had given you, all the way back. There was a third running sometimes, weaker still. Brewed from the almost exhausted grain a third time, it produced a drink hardly stronger than brown water, slightly sweet, slightly bitter, drunk the same day it was made and forgotten. The poorest households lived on this thin stuff. It cost almost nothing to make, because the grain had already done its work for the stronger runnings. It was the very bottom of the drinkable. Small beer did not keep. A few days, at best, before it turned sour and flat. So it was brewed often, sometimes twice a week, in small quick batches, consumed fresh. The strong ale was a weekly or fortnightly event, the product of a long, careful brew day. The small beer was almost continuous, a constant, thin trickle of safe drink flowing through the household to keep everyone watered. And the very young, the babes at the breast, drank neither. They drank their mother's milk, and when they were weaned, they drank small beer thinned further with water, or a thin gruel, or whatever the household could spare. The drink of the household began, for everyone, almost as soon as the mother's milk ended. So the cellar held more than one drink, and more than one class of drinker. The strong ale on its stand, drawn carefully by the cup. The small beer in its open jug, poured freely for anyone. The thin third running, drunk quick and cheap. All of it, every drop, the product of the same patient week of work, divided and graded by strength, feeding the whole household, from the highest to the lowest, from the master to the smallest child. It is time to speak plainly about who actually did all of this. For most of the long history we have been following, the person at the mash tun, the person over the boiling copper, the person skimming the barm at midnight, was a woman. The work of brewing belonged, overwhelmingly, to women. This is not a small detail. It is the shape of the whole story. Brewing was one of the few trades a woman could practice openly and profit from in her own name. The very word brewster means a female brewer, just as a male brewer was a brewer. And in the old records the brewsters appear again and again, selling their ale, running their yards, feeding the town. In some places, for some centuries, almost everyone who sold ale was a woman. Widows brewed, because it was a trade they could run from home while minding children. Married women brewed for the household and for sale. Single women brewed to earn a living. Ale-making was women's work, and it was respected women's work, and it kept a great many households afloat. A brewster's day was brutally long. Up before light to build the fire, the carrying of the water, the milling, the hours over the hot mash, the boiling copper, the cooling, the watching through the night. And while all this went on, the rest of the household did not stop needing her. Children cried. Meals needed cooking, Washing needed doing, animals needed feeding. The brewing had to fit around an already full day, or rather, the rest of the day had to fit around the brewing, which could not wait. And she did it for sale, not only for the household. A good brewster sold her surplus ale to neighbors who did not brew, or could not, or whose batch had failed. She ran a kind of informal pub from her front room. The ale stake, a bundle of twigs or a bush hung over the door, marking her house as a place where drink could be bought. The ale stake was the first sign of the trade, the original public house, run out of a woman's kitchen. Because the ale did not keep, the trade was constant. Brew on Monday, sell through the week, brew again the next Monday. A brewster who let her casks run dry lost her custom to the next yard over. So she brewed again and again and again, week after week, year after year, and the town drank what she made. This began to change as brewing grew bigger and more commercial. The great hopped beer of the towns, brewed in quantity by men, in purpose-built breweries with capital behind them, slowly pushed the small brewster out of the market. The trade that had been women's work for 1,000 years was taken over, professionalized, scaled up, and the women were shouldered aside. The word brewster itself almost died out, replaced by brewer, and the memory of who had done the work faded with the word. But for the whole of the long era we have been sitting in, the ale you drank was almost certainly made by a woman in her own kitchen, by her own hands, in a week of relentless labor that began before dawn and did not end until the cask was tapped. Raise a thought for her the next time you think of an old drink. She is half the reason any of it existed at all. Where ale was sold, there were rules. And where there were rules, there were officials to enforce them. The brewster did not work entirely free. The town watched her and taxed her and tested her drink, and the testing was its own strange ritual. Enter the ale conner. The ale conner was a town official, a man appointed to judge the quality and the measure of the ale sold in the borough. His title survives only in old documents and in a few surnames, but in his day, he was a familiar and not always welcome figure in every brewster's yard. He arrived, sometimes announced, sometimes not, with his leather apron and his blackjack cup, and he tasted. The most famous test attributed to the ale conner is the one with the breeches. It is said he would pour a dab of the ale on a wooden bench, sit on it in his leather breeches, and wait for it to dry. If, when he stood, the bench stuck to him, the ale was judged to have too much unfermented sugar in it, and so was not yet fit, or had been watered and resweetened, and the brewster was fined. If the bench did not stick, the ale had fermented out properly and passed. Whether this was ever truly done in earnest, or whether it is a story grown larger than the truth, no one can now say. But the image survives, and it tells you something about how seriously the testing was taken. The ale conner also checked the measure. Every cup, every jug, every gallon sold had to be a true and lawful measure, stamped and sealed. A brewster who gave short measure, who sold a quart that was really 3/4, was fined. The town kept standard measures, brass or wooden, locked away, and the ale conner carried copies of them on his rounds. Selling ale was a licensed, watched, taxed trade, and the watching was constant. Above the ale conner sat the assize of ale. The assize was a law that fixed the price of ale by the gallon and by the quart according to the price of grain. When grain was cheap, ale was cheap, and the brewster could sell at the lawful price and still profit. When grain was dear, in a bad harvest year, the lawful price rose to let the brewster cover her costs. But she could not charge more than the assize allowed, however scarce grain became, however thin her margin. To overcharge was a fine. To be caught watering the ale was a worse fine, and a mark against her name. and she paid for the right to sell it all. Every brewster who sold ale had to take out a license and pay a fee and have her yard and her sign entered in the town's records. The records of some old towns still survive, and they are page after page of women's names, week after week, paying their dues, swearing to brew true, being fined when they did not. A whole hidden economy of women, visible now only in the dry lines of a clerk's pen. So the brewster worked under a low ceiling of rules and watching men. She brewed, and she sold, and she paid her dues, and she hoped the ale conner would find her drink true and her measure full. And the town drank, knowing that someone, at least, had tasted the cup before them and found it fit. Not every cup of ale was drunk at home, alone with one's own household. The drink was made to be shared, and the old world had its places for the sharing. The tavern, the inn, the alehouse. Each a little different, each with its own character, all of them built around a cask of something brown and a fire and a bench. The simplest was the alehouse. Often no more than a brewster's own front room opened up for the evening. A bench or two pulled to the hearth. The family pushed to the back, strangers sitting drinking what the house had brewed that week. No license, no sign, sometimes just a door that opened and a cup that was filled for a coin. The alehouse was everywhere. Every village had one or several. It was the place a man went after work, the place news passed, the place a traveler could find a cup and a seat and a little warmth before going on. Above the alehouse sat the tavern, a purpose-built house of drink, properly licensed, with a sign hanging over the door and a cellar of its own. The tavern sold wine, too, in the towns, imported and dear, beside the native ale. It had a proper room, proper tables, a fire kept burning, a man or a woman behind the bar whose living it was. The tavern was where business was done, where bargains were struck, where the news of the week was argued over until it was worn smooth. Higher still, the inn. The inn was a tavern with beds, a place for the traveler who could not reach home that night, with a stable for his horse, and a meal beside the fire, and a chamber, however rough, to sleep in. Inns stood along the roads at the end of a day's ride, lonely in the dark, warm inside, the one certain shelter between one town and the next. A great deal of the old world's business and plotting and conspiracy happened in inn-rooms, over cups of ale, far from listening ears. What bound them all together was the cup shared. Drinking alone was unusual, even suspect. Drinking was something you did in company. A man walked to the alehouse of an evening, not only for the drink, but for the voices, the fire, the faces. News traveled through the alehouse faster than through any letter. A stranger's story was heard first over a cup. A bargain was sealed with one. A grievance was aired. A feud was started. A marriage was agreed, all in the warm brown light of a room full of ale. And the drink itself was social in its making and its keeping. The cask on the stand was a shared thing. You drew for your companion before you drew for yourself. You passed the cup. The great loving cup, a vessel with 2 or more handles, was passed around a guild table, each man drinking from the next handle, a literal sharing of the one cup. To refuse the cup was to refuse the company. To drain it was to accept it. So the ale that the brewster made in her hot kitchen, in her long week of work, did not only keep the household from the bad water. It bound the household to its neighbors, and the neighbors to the town, and the town to the road. It was the social glue of the old world, drunk everywhere, by everyone, every day, the brown thread that ran through every gathering from the harvest field to the guild hall. Everything we have been sitting with, all the long week of water and grain and fire and foam, did not last. The old ale, the household ale, The brewster's ale, the unhopped brown drink that had watered the world for 1,000 years, passed away, and it passed away quietly, over a few generations. Until one day it was simply gone. The first blow was the hop. We have spoken of it already. The hopped beer kept longer, traveled further, tasted cleaner and more bitter in a way the Newtown palates came to prefer. It came in from across the water, brewed by men in the big towns, in casks that could survive a week on the road. The old unhopped ale, made fresh and drunk fast, could not compete on distance or on shelf life. Town by town, the demand shifted to the new drink. The brewsters who would not or could not switch to hops watched their custom drain away to the brewers who would. The second blow was scale. To brew in quantity, to feed a growing town, you needed capital. You needed a big building, and a big copper, and a big mash tun, and many hands, and a cellar full of casks. The household brewster, working alone or with her daughters, brewing a barrel or two at a time, could not match the output of a purpose-built brewhouse. The trade moved out of the kitchen and into the brewery, and the brewery was a man's world, run by men with money, employing men for wages. The women were pushed out of the trade their grandmothers had built. The third blow was the water. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the towns began to clean up their water. Engineers laid pipes. Wells were deepened and protected. Filters were built. The terrible logic of disease and dirty water was, at last, understood and acted upon. For the first time in all of human history, a poor person in a town could drink a cup of plain water from a tap and reasonably expect to live. And the moment that became true, the iron reason for drinking ale at every meal began to dissolve. Water became safe. Ale became optional. The daily drink of the world changed. In a single century, from brown and weakly alcoholic to clear and plain. Brewing itself was industrialized. The huge steam-driven breweries of the 19th century, and the even huger factories that followed, bore almost no resemblance to the brewster's kitchen. Grain came in by the ton. Mash tuns were the size of rooms. Coppers were iron tanks heated by coal fires. Everything was measured, timed, mechanized, standardized. The ale that came out was consistent and cheap, and available in quantities the old world could never have imagined. It was also, in a real sense, a different drink. The old ale died the way most old things die. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in a long, slow fade. The last brewsters stopped selling. The last alehouses took down their ale stakes. The last households that brewed their own week after week grew old and passed, and their daughters, who had moved to the towns and drunk the new beer from the new breweries, did not take up the work. What was lost in the end was not the alcohol. There is more of that than ever. What was lost was a whole way of living, a whole weekly rhythm of water and grain and fire and patience, a drink made by hand, in the home, by a woman, for the people nearest her. Gone, almost without remark, in the space of a few lifetimes. There is a small grief at the heart of this story, and it is worth naming plainly. The drink we have spent the evening with no longer exists. The old ale is gone, truly gone, and we cannot get it back. We can brew something like it. Enthusiasts and historians have tried, grinding old grain, gathering old herbs, working from the few surviving recipes. But these are reconstructions, educated guesses, shadows of a shadow. The real drink was never written down, because the women who made it did not write down what they knew. They carried it in their hands and their noses and their memory of 100 batches gone right and gone wrong. When the last of them put down her paddle, the drink went with her, and no amount of careful reverse engineering will bring back exactly what she made, in her kitchen, in her year, with her water, and her herbs, and her yeast. Consider how much of it is unrecoverable. The gruit is gone. The exact blends of bog myrtle and yarrow and wild rosemary that each valley used, gathered from each valley's own wet ground, are lost. The yeast is gone. Every household's barn was its own living creature, its own lineage, and those lineages are all dead now. The grain is gone. The old land races of barley, grown on the old soils with the old manures, have been bred out of existence. The water is gone. Even the water has changed chemically in every well and river since the old brewsters drew it. What we have instead is the great-grandchild of the drink, several thousand times removed. The modern pint, clear and cold, and fizzy, and consistent, and hopped, is the descendant of the old ale in the way that a city street lamp is the descendant of a tallow candle. There is a line of descent. There is no longer much resemblance. And the drinking of it has changed even more than the drink. We drink alone now, often, or in pairs, in front of screens. The cup, a private thing. The old ale was never private. It was drawn from a shared cask and passed in a shared cup in a crowded room. The whole culture of the drink, the alehouse, and the loving cup, and the brewster's open door, has thinned to almost nothing. We have more alcohol available to us than any people in history, and less of the communal ritual that once surrounded it. So sit for a moment with the loss. It is not a tragic loss. No one starved for it. No war was fought over it. It is the ordinary, quiet loss that time inflicts on everything made by hand, by the poor, by women, in kitchens, for everyday use. The kind of thing that no one thinks to preserve, because everyone assumes it will always be there, until one morning it is not, and no one quite remembers when it went. The old ale kept the world alive for 1,000 years and more. It kept the water from killing us. It kept the harvest grain through the lean months. It kept the household talking around the fire. It kept the brewster's hands busy and her family fed. And then, having done all that work, it slipped away and left us only the word, and the habit, and a faint brown memory of something warm and bitter and shared. We have come a very long way together tonight. From a dry handful of grain and a dark barn, all the way to a tapped cask and a warm kitchen, and beyond it, to the slow fading of a whole way of making the world's daily drink. It is a small history, in one sense. No kings, no battles, no great names to remember. Only grain and water and fire and the patient hands of people who are almost all forgotten. And yet, it is not a small history. It is the history of how ordinary people stayed alive, day after day, in a world that gave them very little margin. The water would have sickened them. The grain would have rotted, or sprouted, or been eaten by weevils, or been taxed away. The harvest would have failed in some years, and the hunger would have come close. And through all of it, the patient, weekly work of steeping and malting and mashing and boiling and fermenting turned what the field gave into something that would keep a family watered and fed and warm and just slightly lifted through the long evenings for another week. If you have listened this far, you have walked in your mind through a brewster's kitchen. You have smelled the wet grain and the warm malt and the sharp green herbs. You have felt the heat of the copper on your face and the cool of the cellar on your skin. You have heard the low murmur of the working vat in the dark. None of it was grand. All of it was necessary. And almost none of it is done that way anymore. The next time you pass a field of barley, bending in the wind, you might think of the long road each ear of it once traveled, through the barn, and the steep, and the malting floor, and the mill, and the mash, before it became a cup of something brown. The next time you turn on a tap and drink a glass of clear, safe water, you might spare a thought for the centuries when no one could do that. And the brewster's cask was the only clean drink in the house. The next time you sit with a cup of something warm, in company, you might remember the alehouse and the loving cup, and the way a drink once bound a whole town together. For now, though, the fire has burned down. The cask on its stand is nearly empty. The brewster has wiped her hands on her apron and gone, at last, to her bed. And the kitchen is dark and still and smells faintly of malt. There is nothing left to do tonight, but let the work be finished, and let the evening close. So settle deeper if you can. Let your own breathing slow to the pace of the cellar, cool and quiet and even. The grain is gathered, the ale is made, the long week is over. There is only the dark, and the warmth, and the slow turning of the year toward morning. Sleep, if sleep is what you came for. The brewster's work is done, and yours, for tonight, is done too.